we'll enter into the Q&A. And one of the big rationales for these webinar series is to give the audience members, you, the chance to query and interact with our speakers today. And in order to do that, I'd just like to ask you to direct your questions to the Q&A box. There's a button right at the bottom of your Zoom screen that lets you do that. You can also post questions in chat, although I'm reluctant to do that. We prefer them to be in Q&A because it's a bit more interactive and it helps us manage the questions more effectively. But in any event, please do feel free to submit your questions at the Q&A box at any time during the event. And finally, just to point out that we're recording this event right now, and after the seminar is over, we will be posting this as a link on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much for joining us for this event. As I mentioned, our topic today is talking from afar, the telephone. And when we talk about the telephone, of course, we tend to think of this, which is the primary way that we talk to people from afar. And people no doubt have seen these videos of young people encountering a rotary phone for the first time. Have no clue what any of the things do, and this just underscores the fact that the telephone has an interesting, fascinating, actually, technological history. It went through multiple iterations before we arrived at our present digital telephony. And today we'll have two speakers who will be telling us about that fascinating history. Kicking off our presentations will be Daniel McVeigh, who's the author of An Early History of the Telephone, 1664 to 1865. Gives you an idea of how deep the historical roots are. And then he'll be followed by Ed Grosvenor, who is the editor-in-chief of American Heritage and Invention and Technology magazines. And he's also co-authored a biography of his great-grandfather, of all things, Alexander Graham Bell, The Life and Times of the Inventor of the Telephone. So welcome, gents. We're glad that you're here. And as I understand it, Dan, we're going to start off with you.
All right, I'm going to move to my screen share here, and instead of looking at
there we are. I hope everyone can see this.
Herman von Helmholtz up there. All right, so I'm going to start with how many people contributed to the invention of the telephone. To better understand this, we have to look at a community of instrument makers who conducted acoustic and physiological research, making various inventions or musical instruments, all of which led to Philip Rice building the first telephone, which did articulate human speech. All shared and developed ideas in meetings at the Royal Society in London, the Physical Society in Germany, or the Academy of Science in France, to name a few. Letters are exchanged, and many develop papers and lectures together. There's a cumulative synthesis of knowledge built over many years by a community who contributed to the invention of Rice's DOS phone. Some of these individuals are formally educated and some are self-educated. In mention of some of the musical instruments, Robert Hooke in 1668 writes about a music cylinder with pewter tips pinched by cylindrical rings. If we saw this today, we'd call it a string phone. In his notes, he doesn't really talk about it articulated human speech, but more sound. He treats it as a musical instrument. He also conducts numerous experiments where he propagates sound over a wire at a great distance, and other experiments where he visualizes sound waves. At 19, Charles Wheatstone one in a long line of musical instrument makers and his family, invents the enchanted lyre, which is more of a full room installation than a small instrument. With vibrations from a remote piano transmitted through a long wire, they activate sounding boards and other string instruments in a room that's afar. The world's first network musical performance is done in his father's shop in Pall Mall, England in 1821. In 1857, we're going to talk about Hermann von Helmholtz had his Bonn lecture on the physiological causes of harmony in music. He wrote this for the layman as a concise background on the nature of musical tone, as well as to explain to them the mechanisms of the ear and how it worked. He later publishes this lecture in On the Sensation of Tone in 1863. The core idea here was to explain the ear and the nature of timbre. Right? If we look back at inventions over that 200-year period, Robert Hooke also discusses the human ear. He developed an ear trumpet, which he used to help the hard of hearing. He does this in the Royal Society over 3 sessions, where they deconstruct and reconstruct the invention each time he brings it in and demos it until he gets to a final invention. René Laennec invents the stethoscope in France in 1816, and then Sir Charles Wheatstone, inventor of the commercial telegraph, constructed a very similar device to the stethoscope in 1827 after studying Servat and Wolst on the physiology of the ear. Wheatstone calls his invention a microphone. Hermann von Helmholtz studied the human ear extensively and invented similar devices right up until Philip Rice carves a human ear out of a wooden beer barrel, right? In 1854, Charles Berzol writes a paper on the articulating concept of the telephone. It's published on August 26th in Illustration Journal Universelle. He starts out explaining the basic principle of the electromagnetic telegraph and the printing telegraph experiments in London. From there, he moves on to the idea of the speaking telephone, and I quote, "I asked myself, for example, if speech itself couldn't also be transmitted by electricity. In a word, if we couldn't speak in Vienna and be heard in Paris. This is how actually it can be achieved. We know that sounds are made by vibrations that are brought to the ear by the same vibrations reproduced by an intervening medium. Suppose that a man speaks near a movable disc, sufficiently flexible, loose enough to lose none of the vibrations of the voice. That disc alternatively makes or breaks currents from a battery. You may have at a distance another disc which simultaneously executes the same vibrations." Charles Berzol had now said in print what had been on the minds of many since the invention of the telegraph. It's important to note that Philip Reis was fluent in French. On several occasions, we see Reis reference French scientists like de la Rive in letters to Faraday. It's very possible that Philip Reis read Berzol's article before he invented his phone in 1860. All right, so the device that we're looking at right now on the screen is the device by Hermann von Helmholtz. Hermann von Helmholtz constructed this device he called the tuning fork sounder. This instrument functioned somewhat like a single pipe in an electric organ. The device had 3 main parts: platinum wires attached to the end of a tuning fork that ran down to sit above a full cup of mercury kept the tuning forks constantly vibrating with intermittent current. This is the make or break contact technology. The electromagnet generated the current, and finally, the metal arm controlled the loudness of each tuning fork echoing in the cardboard cylinder or resonator. The amazing result of this instrument is that it produced vowel sounds with great clarity. This was key to Philip Reis' research as well as Alexander Graham Bell's. Reis used the platinum wires and the cylinder or resonators in his first 7 forms of his DOS phone. It's also important to note that the technology Rice's phone used was based on the make or break contact principle. So, a brief recap of contributions which led to the final invention of the phone. We see Robert Hooke's first investigations into acoustics back in starting in 1665. Volta's discovery of the first battery, which gave Faraday and Henry the source of electricity, the first steady source of electric current to further their research in electricity. Ampere's laws. William Sturgeon wrapped a wire around a soft metal bar to create the world's first electromagnet, or Sturgeon's bar. Ernest Calandy's figures. Sir Charles Wheatstone's experiments on the tradition of musical sounds and telegraph. C.G. Page's electronic tuning fork, known as galvanic music. De Larive, Gasson, and Marianne on the magnetic tick. An article published by Charles Bourseau on how the telephone might work, to Hermann von Helmholtz's detailed deconstruction and reconstruction of the human ear, which led to his definitive work on the sensation of tone. It was the research of all these people which gave Philip Rice a base knowledge which he needed to invent the telephone. In 1851, Philip Rice became a member of the Physical Society, which held its meetings at the Snackenberg Museum in Germany. Weekly lectures are given on the topics in chemistry and physics on a regular basis. Some of its honorary members include Hermann von Helmholtz, Michael Faraday, Professor Sturgeon, Sir Charles Wheatstone. Being an active participant in the scientific community, Rice keeps up with the research. Specifically, he had the interest in electricity and magnetism. In 1855, he sends a letter to Michael Faraday, now head of the Royal Society in London, regarding a recent article that Faraday had written. Faraday delivered lectures and published articles on a regular basis, which were read throughout Europe. These letters on record between Faraday and Philip Rice regarding electricity and magnetism dates August 9th, 1855, Faraday to Philip Rice, Royal Institution, November 19th, 1855, Philip Rice back to Faraday, Berlin, December 10th, 1855. After this, the correspondence of these 3 letters, Philip Rice and Michael Faraday wrote a paper together on the action of non-conducting bodies in electric induction. This appeared in the January issue of Philosophical Magazine and Journal of Science. Faraday also delivered this to a paper of the Royal Society in the form of a lecture in 1856. All right, let's take a look at, finally, we'll see. Here's Philip Rice's wooden ear. Boy, you can't get more German than this. So Philip Rice carves a wooden ear out of a German beer barrel. And then he uses the sausage skin as the membrane, right? So Rice's wooden ear had a thin membrane, which is constructed of sausage skin. Against the center of the sausage skin membrane rested the lower end of a small curved lever of platinum wire, which represented the hammer or bone, the hammer bone of the ear. In short, when a person spoke into the ear, the sound waves caused the membrane or sausage skin to vibrate. These vibrations would then set the hammer in motion, as does the hammer bone in the ear. This now caused the upper level of Rice's configuration to vary. When that lever was put into motion by a vibrating membrane, it caused the electric contact to move as to open or a closed circuit, or a make or break contact technology. Rice believed the key to constructing a working device which would transmit sound over a wire was to recreate the human ear in mechanical form. All right, so there we have Rice's ear. Now, how do we know it really worked? All right, so from 1860 to 1865, he conducts numerous public demonstrations of the technology of his DOS phone in front of hundreds of people throughout Europe. His most famous probably was the exhibition of the telephone to the Naturalist Association of Germany, September 21st, 1864. Professor Bergendorf, Hermann von Helmholtz, and even the young student E.W. Blake from the United States was there, who will go on to create the Blake transmitter. So he's got a very prestigious crowd. He actually, in the morning, runs a test with the DOS phone, and the test in the morning doesn't go very well. You know, the phone is not that great at articulating speech in the morning. However, he gets a stroke of luck, and in the afternoon, the device goes off flawlessly and delivers articulating speech. He gets a thunderous round of applause at this lecture, and he was very relaxed, and he spoke very frankly and openly about all the gyrations he went through for the first trials of the invention, how it worked, how it didn't work, how it failed at the beginning, up until when it did start to work, and he did get, finally, the live transmission of articulating human speech. This demonstration was so successful, it spurred quite a bit of PR for Philip Rice. He got an article in the textbook of physics, the technical physics publication, recent apparatus of acoustics, and finally an article in the handbook of applied electricity. There was one more iteration in 1865. A phone of Philip Rice was given to Stephen Mitchell Yates he was an instrument maker in Dublin, and he created an electromagnet receiver, which actually made Rice's phone a lot more articulate. He demonstrated the phone on March 14th, 1865 at Trinity College in Dublin for the Philosophical Society. In the end, Rice's work was lost in translation. Many believe it was a misunderstanding of German to English translation of the word tone, which is one of the major reasons it was not properly recognized or got credit for his work today. Rice referred and wrote to his device reproducing tones, T-O-N-E-S, but it's imperative to understand that the word tone, T-O-N, in German, or plural tone, T-O-N-E, is equivalent to our English word sound and includes articulate as well as musical sound, depending on the context in which the word was used. So in articles in the US, this really gets lost in translation. Philip Rice became ill and died at the young age of 40 in 1874, so he did not participate in the race for the telephone patent. Alexander Graham Bell did give Philip Rice credit by name in the paper entitled Researches in Electronic Telephony, which he presented at the Academy of Arts and Sciences in May of 1876, and then at the Society of Telegraphic Engineers in November of 1877. Bell also references Rice's work in an article written by Professor Bagata in Dillinger's Polytechnic Journal in 1863. Well, that's it. Thank you for that time and attention. I just have there's the picture of Stephen Mitchell Yates's improved receiver for Rice's phone. But really, we'll leave it with the shot of Philip Rice's telephone. All right.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks so much, Dan. Fascinating to me is the number of disparate threads that stretch back to the 17th century that finally come together in the invention of this device, the telephone. And speaking of some of the people that you mentioned, of course, in my own field of physiology, Hermann Helmholtz is a very prominent figure. I mean, he worked not only on sound, but also on a variety of things like nerve impulse and optics and those kinds of things, all of which brought a really distinctive approach to the science of physiology, which then, of course, was just blossoming under the auspices of people like Claude Bernard. So speaking of a disparate thread, Hermann von Helmholtz represents a virtual trunk in bringing all these ideas together. Okay, well, thank you, Dan, for that presentation. Let's move on to Ed Grosvenor now, who's going to tell us more about the history of the telephone. Ed, take it away.
Oh, seem to have lost my. There we go. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, I had it all set up. Give me a second here.
Yeah.
I've got two screens, and so sometimes it makes it a little bit. There we go. Can you see that? No?
No, you'll need to down at the bottom, click
Yeah.
the green screen
Yeah.
share again, and then select the window that you would like to share.
No, I know I am. The problem is I've got multiple screens.
You should be able to identify the different screens there, and then there's a
Yeah, no,
share
I know
button.
it's not showing the other screen. That's the problem, because I've got, sorry.
And of course, once you've selected it, there's another share button down at the lower right of the of that window.
I'm going to exit full screen for a second, because I think.
Yeah, that could be it.
If not, I can share the.
No, I got it. I just, the problem is it's going to the other screen. Sorry, guys.
That's okay.
Just give me 1 second. I know it's here. It's just.
I've always the joke is that Zoom calls are like a seance. You know, you have to communicate with this other world to be able to successfully pull it off. and we all have this problem. Don't worry.
Okay, now. Well, you know, you guys, we had it working fine before.
I know, and I can
Okay.
I can testify to that.
There, can you see it now?
Not yet.
No, here, I'll just share the PDF version that I have. Oh, hey, there we go.
Oh, that looks great.
Got
There
it?
you go. Yeah, that's your screen, Ed. All right,
Okay.
we're in business.
All right. Sorry about that. I'm trying to get 3 screens on two screens. Anyway, so Bell was born in 1847. He was a really unusual young man. He was training to be a classical musician, which was really important because it really trained him about sound and how to appreciate very tiny nuanced differences in sound. He also, his father had invented something called visible speech, which was created symbols for each of the different possible hundreds of different sounds that a voice could make. So he could transcribe any language in the world. And his son, as a teenager, young Graham, he was called Graham at the time, actually did a lot of work with tuning forks and sticking them down his throat and getting them to vibrate, and discovered the actual way that vowels were created, and submitted a paper and was admitted to a really prestigious Royal Academy as a teenager for his research on vowel sounds. Here's an example of some of the visible speech by his father, Melville Bell. They moved to Canada, and then young Graham moved to Boston to start his own school to teach elocution, especially to young deaf students. Here he is with the School of the Deaf in Boston. Now, around this time, this is a really important invention in the history of American technology. This is the Stern's duplex. And Joseph Stern invented this machine to send 2 different messages across a telegraph line at the same time. So overnight, he doubled the capacity of Western Union, and they paid a fortune for the museum. And there's a picture of his mansion. So Bell, Elijah Gray, Thomas Edison were all trying to leapfrog Stern's and do one that was a quadruplex, or in Bell's case, he was trying to do 8 sounds. He was supported financially by a patent lawyer and entrepreneur in Boston named Gardner Green Hubbard. And while he was working on his inventions, he fell in love with Mabel, his daughter. And he was turned down. He asked for Mabel's hand in marriage, and that was turned down by the family because he hadn't established himself. So the real reason that he invented the telephone was to marry Mabel. This is one of the first things that he developed. It's actually it's following. He was very interested in Helmholtz. In fact, the first work that he did was to replicate Helmholtz's tuning fork sounder experiment where he would have a tuning fork in one room and the sound, the tone would go through the wire into another room. But remember, that's only one frequency. That's just one tone. That's not really a full intelligible voice. This is a really important invention because you would speak into it. It has actually a part of a human ear in there, and it would inscribe on lamp black on glass, and it would inscribe the shape of the of sound waves. And this sort of Bell took this and went towards the telephone, and Thomas Edison, using the same machine, went in the direction of the recording phonograph. This I found when I was researching in my book. And by the way, I had found that I was the first person to find that early teenage research that he did. I was really excited to find it in the Library of Congress. I also found this while I was researching my book. This is the first real patent machine. He called it a telautograph or autograph telegraph. And these are some actual faxes that he transmitted in 1875. And he was awarded a patent by the U.S. Patent Office. There it is on the right. And this is really important, and I'll get to that in a minute. In 1875, after 2 years of work, and then they hired, with money from Hubbard, he hired Thomas Edison to help him construct the devices. In June of 1875, he first, using a membrane transmitter like this, he first was able to transmit sounds that he could understand were complex sounds as opposed to a single frequency. And he's always considered this really the first telephone. There's been a lot of discussion over whether Gray or Bell invented the telephone, and they both submitted on the same day, as many people know, to the patent office. Gray's was a patent caveat, and Bell's was a full patent application after many more years of work. There was a book published a few years ago that showed this similarity between Elijah Gray's drawing of a liquid transmitter in his telephone and Bell's drawing of a liquid transmitter a few weeks later. And the author Schulman claimed that, picking up on a debunked charge of fraud, that Bell had bribed the patent examiner to inspect Elijah Gray's patent. The problem is that he never considered that maybe Gray was stealing it from Bell, because there was a lot of that going on and Gray had a lot more resources. The problem with the theory of stealing the liquid transmitter is that there's the patent for the fax, and right in the center of it, right in the center where you see J, there's two liquid transmitters. And then on the left, you can see a drawing that he did in 1873, which had liquid transmitters. So that's not an argument that really flies. Here's Bell's notebook. This is the original notebook. I've held it in my hand. It's kind of interesting. There's the drawing of a liquid transmitter, which was the way that he finally was able to get it to work intelligibly. And at the bottom on the left, you see it says, "I then shouted into M," mouthpiece, the following sentence: "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." To my delight, he came and declared that he had heard and understood what I said. I asked him to repeat the words, and he repeated them. So if you see down below here, here's the problem with the earlier people who were trying to develop telephones. And there were a lot of them. I mean, Rice was the most prominent, but there were a lot of people who were trying to do it. Most of them were coming at it really from like the sound of a buzzer, which is just a fast, intermittent tone, but sped up. And that direct current intermittently sent doesn't work. It doesn't have the full structure of the voice. And the difference with Bell's telephone was he happened upon the concept of this undulatory current, where the voice would induce a current in the phone, in the transmitter, that was much more complex and much more, it had not only the intensity, but the pitch and the timbre, the quality of the voice. So you could actually understand. There's a lot of debate over Rice. A professor at UVA, Bernard Carlson, has read everything that Rice wrote, and there's nothing in there about the principle of the induction of inducing the current of an undulating current. So I think Rice is very close. If he had lived, maybe he would have gotten a patent. I don't know. I know Bell knew about him. I don't think he studied it that well because he couldn't read German. Anyway, so here's the Rice machine. I know it's been studied. The actual device has been studied by the Smithsonian, and they said that if the contacts were tight or were dirty, they were capable of transmitting an undulating current, but we don't know that he was actually doing that. There's another person you might have heard about. The US Congress actually passed a resolution saying that Antonio Meucci had in fact invented the telephone before Bell. And the problem is that he then sold what he claimed were his rights to a company that started selling stock and franchises to produce Meucci telephones. The Bell Telephone Company sued for patent infringement, along with many dozens of other companies they had to sue. And the defense of Meucci's co-defendants was, hey, we never even saw a working telephone. So the problem is, and as the judge said, well, in Mr. Meucci's patent caveat, which may be his highest expression of his invention, it can easily be disposed of because it doesn't make sense. He had the electrical current going through the body of the people who were talking. So that's not really, it's almost nonsensical if you read the patent, but people don't, the caveat. Bell, a few months later, he did the first transmission of speech one way. This is one way because they hadn't invented two-way yet. From Boston out to Salem, and he thought that actually the way he was going to make money from the telephone was selling tickets to people to come and see a telephone work, and he made good money off this lecture and bought a little silver replica of a telephone for Mabel. And this is the vision that Scientific American did that month. Wow, someday people might be actually able to talk in New York and be heard in Paterson, New Jersey, or Yonkers. And you notice they all have pair of, they have one for transmitting and one for receiving. I don't know how much further we want to go. I can talk about a couple of other quickly of his inventions. This Bell actually thought was his most important invention was the photophone. And he took sunlight comes down, goes through a lens. There's actually more devices in the one that worked, and takes the voice, vibrates, the light vibrates off the back of a mirror that's made to vibrate by the voice speaking in the mouthpiece. And he actually transmitted the voice wirelessly for 400 yards. Invented a parabolic dish with selenium in the center that he made so sensitive to light that it would pick up the beam of light and then transform it back into sound. And he was able, this is the Franklin Schools, now the headquarters of DC schools, but Bell transmitted by his photophone to his cousin, Chichester Bell, who was in the Franklin School, and he said, Chester, he yelled into the photophone, Chester, if you hear what I say, come to the window. And so he looked over, and there was just Chichester Bell in the window waving at him. So, and that's, of course, really the foundation of fiber optics. So it's a pretty important invention. He also invented the metal detector, trying to save the life of the assassinated President James Garfield. He spent many years perfecting the phonograph. He started a company called Columbia, because in the District of Columbia, Columbia Graphophone. Edison's phonograph didn't really work because once you made a recording and you played it back, it destroyed the recording. So it really wasn't practical. And in fact, he gave up and went on to other things. Bell got a patent for a different form of engraving and then a number of different patents. The one on the left at the bottom, made in the Singer sewing machine, was then became commercially used for transcribing or dictating, and that became Dictaphone Company. And the Columbia Graphophone Company started selling music on their cylinders, and that became Columbia Records. So two companies that he started. This is kind of interesting. Bell clearly designed created the first flat disc record for his graphophone. Emil Berliner is often credited with that, but the Smithsonian has almost 200 flat disc records, every single one of which by Bell predates the first Berliner flat disc record. He was even trying, the one on the right here, he was even trying to do magnetic medium with reels. And the one on the bottom is kind of interesting. He was inscribing sound on celluloid film. So this is 40 years before talkies. So he was really ahead of his time, but he didn't get them to work. So they really aren't his invention. He also flew the first airplane in Canada and was not too far behind the Wright brothers. And there's a drawing that he did in the 1870s of a bird and he was going to do a flying machine with wingtips that would go up and down to control. And this is their airplane that they built, which was the first one with ailerons and also with three-wheel landing gear. But I think we should probably take some questions, so I'll pause now. And
okay, thanks, Ed. That was absolutely fascinating. Again, let me just remind people in the audience, the Q&A box is where we'd like you to submit questions. Right now, the box is empty, so lots of opportunity to fill it up. In the meantime, Ed, you mentioned something called a liquid transmitter, and just for the benefit of those of us who aren't familiar with that technology, could you briefly tell us about what the liquid transmitter was?
Well, there's a number of different ways to get a variable resistance. So it's a variable, it's like a resistor, but trying to induce that current, it's very difficult to figure out how to get the sound. It's more than just a membrane. A membrane, and this is what Bell had these. He was initially trying to do a membrane transmitter, like Rice had, like other people had, and he couldn't get it to work. And the problem is you have to induce a much more sophisticated current, structured current in the transmitter. Otherwise, you're just basically doing a tone, a musical tone. Elijah Gray also invented a telephone, what he called a telephone. Well, I think he called it the musical harp or something. I can't remember, but a couple of years before Bell, but he was only able to do tones, and so he gave up on it. Later claimed that he invented the telephone, but in fact, Elijah Gray, the first telephone he ever saw working was the one Bell's at the Centennial exhibit in July of '76. But getting that, inducing that, a very, and actually he ended up doing it without, it wasn't even in circuit. It was just the leftover electromagnetism that was in the coil. It's really fascinating, but I'm not an electrical physicist, but Bernie Carlson at UVA is much better on this, and he's recreated each step in Bell's experiments. And the liquid transmitter was kind of a way that he was able to do that, but it was kind of like a side thing. He went then back to an iron diaphragm, and that was what worked in that coffin telephone that I showed in the exhibit to Salem.
Yeah. And what was the liquid?
There was a number of different liquids. The one that was in that fax machine was mercury, and he spent a lot of time working with mercury, liquid mercury. There were various dilutions of acidified water. This was acid in water.
Something that could conduct and store
Right.
electrical charge. I'm gathering from that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me was that, especially Bell's insight. Maybe others had it as well. And this question is really directed to the both of you. This kind of mental breakthrough that no, sound is not pulses, it's oscillations and it's undulations and things like that. What was the origin of that? I mean, I think Dan, you mentioned that that some of this appreciation predated Bell, but it was really just an amazing insight, actually a qualitatively different insight. And what were the origins of this undulatory concept of sound and energy?
So when you look at the early history, a lot of the inventions were musical instruments.
Yeah.
I mean, I was stunned when I was doing the research to find how much work Robert Hooke had done, on the ear and on music and on propagating sound over a wire and creating musical instruments and the first string phone, and this went on. I mean, Sir Charles Wheatstone's family, he had a family that created musical instruments that went back 50 or 60 years, right? So he was kind of born into it, so there was more. It's almost like they had to do their studies first in the arts before they were allowed to play in the sciences.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also Bell, Daniel, you may remember this. I can't remember if it was Wheatstone or Helmholtz. I think it was Wheatstone, because Bell actually called on Wheatstone, and he had read Helmholtz, but he didn't read German very well. But Wheatstone had made a talking head, and Bell, as a teenager, replicated this. He and his two brothers, they actually got sort of a rubber-like a thing for the tongue. They actually had a dog. I think it was a dog's skull, and they wrapped it all up, and they had all this stuff, and they had a bellows, and one would blow on the bellows, and the other would manipulate the lips and the tongue, and they could actually get it to talk. But the main thing they used it for was they were in a boarding house, and they put it out in the stairway and scare the neighbors.
Well, I know that you talk about the translation, and Bell didn't speak German, but he worked with Edison, and Edison actually there was a very detailed report on Rice's phone written in a Polytechnic journal, and this was given over to he was the Western Union. Who was Western Union? That was
Western Union was the wealthiest corporation in the world, because they had a monopoly on all the telegraph.
Western Union. I'm drawing a blank. What was the guy's name?
Was it Morse?
William Orton.
William Orton. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, William Orton had this transcript translated into English and handed it to Edison. So even though Bell didn't speak German or get those translations, Edison did. And Bell worked with Edison to create different variations. And, there it was. But again,
no, Edison had to be sued because he leapfrogged Bell with his carbon transmitter. And Western Union was it was David and Goliath. They were trying to crush this little tiny Bell company because they had all this money. The first Hubbard went to Orton and offered the patent for $100,000, and it's often considered to be one of the worst business decisions in American history that he turned it down. And he hired Edison instead to leapfrog Bell and improve on the telephone, and then use their copper wire huge infrastructure to beat the telephone companies. And it was only when that was the first of the big telephone suits when they sued Western Union and they won. Bell companies won. The settlement was Western Union got 10%. Bell got the manufacturing facilities for Western Electric to make the telephones. And then I think they ended up using Edison's carbon transmitter. So yeah, in a sense, Rice might have gone through Edison that way. I think Bell knew of him, but the phone.
No. But did Alexander Graham Bell work with Edison? I thought
No.
I heard you say that.
No, they
worked together on a
were rivals. They were
Okay.
definitely major rivals.
Okay. All
Bell
right.
was always bitter that Edison had tried to leapfrog him with the carbon transmitter, and which was why he then picked up the phonograph and said, "The heck with you guys, I'm going to do a better phonograph than you." He called it a graphophone, which was to write sound. And in fact, he patented it. And then when Edison wanted to commercially produce phonographs, he had to buy the patents from Bell. And really pissed him off. He said that team of scoundrels or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that's Edison got his major leapfrog, the major jump forward with Orton turning around and handing him all that work that was translated, right? So that was his starting point, and he went on to invent the micro transmitter, the aerophone, a stethoscope, a megaphone, right? Even his research on the megaphone, you can take from Hooke's research on the ear trumpet, and you can compare his notes like paragraph for paragraph to what Edison did. Edison doesn't give Hooke any credit for that,
That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Didn't you say though? One of you say that at one point Edison was in the employ of Bell?
No.
Okay, I guess I misheard that. All right.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I was. But that's good. I'm
Okay.
glad you clarified that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Because that is good to know.
They all Edison and Bell and they both worked for a while in the Charles Williams shop in Boston, which was really the only shop that was making telegraphs and early experimental equipment like that. And Bell actually had to move because he was afraid that there was too much spying going on.
Oh, really?
Edison worked there for a while, and then he moved to New Jersey.
Oh, I see.
Well,
Okay.
A big hole in the presentations today. I mean, with 14 minutes, you don't have enough time, right, to cover.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got 50 people working on telegraphs, around 1837, 50 separate inventors, and there's so much work being done there with propagation of sound over wires and experiments and, key players. All you ever hear about, usually is the patent lawsuits, with Cook and Wheatstone and Morris and Henry, right? But there was so much invention, and that really, that's a big contributor to all that starts to come out with the telephone and how it's
Well,
transferred.
of course, one reason that Samuel Morse won the patent from the patent office was that the head of the patent office wanted him to marry his daughter. So even though quite a few people, Joseph Henry basically invented the telegraph.
Yes, he did.
Quite a few people working on it, but Morse was very interested in the patent examiner's daughter. And patent examiner figured, okay, I'll make the guy rich. He'll marry my daughter and she'll be set for life. The problem was she thought he was a crazy old man. So
well, he didn't, and he didn't have the background. Morse did not have the scientific background that Joseph Henry did.
Right. No, he was a painter. He was an artist.
Yeah. Let me just remind everyone in the audience that the Q&A box is still awaiting questions. But this whole dive that you guys have just gone into about the kind of earthy nature of the scientific competition and things like this, it brings to mind an ongoing debate in science and technology right now, which is how is it that you can best move innovation forward? What's the source of scientific progress? And as you know, there's two diametrically opposed schools of thought there. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle of that. On the one side, you have the lone genius, and it's driven strictly by merit, and it's kind of Darwinian idea that the best idea will win. And then, of course, the opposite pole right now is that no, you have to have these big, diverse, cooperative teams of scientists to be able to move science forward. That science, as we practice it today, is sort of stuck in a rut of patriarchy and those kinds of things. And what I'm hearing from you guys is the history of the telephone and the progress was driven really by strong competition between very strong individuals, and that there wasn't a great deal of cooperation going on in there. So let me just pose the question, how is it that you think that we can best move technology forward? Where's the source of innovation? How are we going to foster innovation and creativity? What are your thoughts on this? What are the lessons we derive from the invention of the telephone?
Well, I can address that. I'm sure Daniel has some thoughts too, but it's interesting if you look at Bell. Bell, he's been disparaged in some textbooks or stories, saying, oh, he really wasn't a serious, educated electrician. He was an amateur. Well, he had actually been doing his experiments for over 3 years, and he was self-taught. That's true. But he had a big advantage over the electricians like Elijah Gray, because they could only see the intermittent current, and Bell came in with the training, the analogies from biology, from physiology on how the ear. He understood how the mouth created sound, how the ear picked it up and processed it. And so I edit Invention in Technology magazine, and we believe that it's really important for students also to kind of read, listen, learn these lessons and stories of invention and how inventors did things, so they can kind of apply that even in today's context where everything is so team-oriented and specialized. And a dean of one of the engineering schools told me, we're graduating kids who are brilliant in math or brilliant in physics, but they really don't know about innovation and inventing and teamwork, and these analogies from the past can be very helpful in learning that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's the best argument right there for team collaboration. Mm-hmm. When you look at the background, the depth that Bell had with understanding speech and working with the deaf, and and then putting him in with a group of engineers. That's the way it really has to go. And if you look at the trajectory of that 200-year span up to the history of the telephone, in the beginning, before 1900, there was a much more open, you didn't have companies and patent restrictions and lawyers, pulling the scientists back. You can't talk about this. You can't disclose that. You can't publish about this. It's going to cost us money, or somebody will steal our idea. No, you had this open collaboration. They'd go to the Philosophical Society on a Saturday evening and hear, a paper from, somebody working on electromagnetic current, or somebody working on speech, or somebody with a new musical instrument. You had this open collaboration, right? And what he just said about Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, is just nails it right. You couldn't have said it better.
So kind of the message I'm hearing here is that a kind of I don't know, intellectual anarchism, can we call it, where there's absolute freedom of exchange of ideas and thoughts, and certainly there was competition. Everyone wanted to be there first, but for some reason you didn't have the kind of cutthroat cutting off of others from one's own perceived path to wealth and fame. And I can certainly agree to that. I mean, when you talk about what's going to drive science forward, if you throw out the word diversity, everyone agrees that intellectual diversity is very, very important to have. And Dan, you mentioned very pointedly that Helmholtz came in. He had a different way of thinking about sound than the electricians did, and that was just an incredibly fertile source of information. But now we seem to be trying to regulate the formation of groups of people, that they're expected to behave a certain way. They're expected to reflect a certain demographic composition because HR departments are involved in here. There are strict rules for how you can collaborate and how you can interact with one another. So do you think we're in an era now where innovation is actually stifled by these kinds of imposition of rules and regulations and how we actually conduct the operation of teams?
Well, I'm a historian. I'm not really involved in
Yeah.
any cutting edge investigations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I noticed that one of your commenters said that greed is identified as one of the forces hindering the free exchange of ideas. Well, yes and no. I mean, greed is, Bell was an immigrant of very modest means.
Yeah.
And Hubbard was one of the wealthiest men in Cambridge, and they had looked down on him on his shabby clothes. And, he wanted to establish himself in life. And so he wanted desperately, I mean, he was working around the clock until he was getting sick from exhaustion, trying to invent this telephone to make his fortune so that he could marry the love of his life. So I can't take too, you can't take too, you can't be too negative about greed, unless it gets to the level of, buying Twitter.
Yeah. And of course, the other aspect of it is, from where do these collaborative teams emerge? Do they emerge organically, as it were, from the bottom up, or are they imposed by some kind of higher authorities that may not actually know what these teams are doing? And
I would agree with that. I would agree with that right there. Higher authorities who are not sure what those teams are doing.
Yeah.
But you can see even, the lesson from Daniel's remarks is that even in the 1860s and the 1870s, important innovations came from the work of a lot of people, and and Bell recognized that. In fact, he went to Joseph Henry and told him the idea of the telephone. And he said, I don't think I have enough electrical knowledge to make this work. Should I publish the idea now? Yeah. And Henry told him, no, you go back and you get the electrical knowledge, teach yourself, do it, and make this work yourself.
Yeah.
So, and he was always grateful to Henry for that.
Yeah. And of course, this is reminiscent of something that goes right back to the very heart of organized science, and I'm mindful of groups like the Lunar Society in northern New England around Manchester, which had an incredible luminary of different minds, and they would get together and just, I don't want to say shoot the bull because it was more formal than that, but again, this incredible cross-fertilization of people from different ideas, from different disciplines, from metallurgy to steam engines to electrical phenomena and so forth. And of course, the same could be said about, of course, the American Philosophical Society that was founded by Franklin, along the similar lines, very open kinds of things. And this is something that scientists, I think, respond to very instinctively. We tend to think that it's that it's good to collaborate, it's good to share. And as you mentioned, what seems to have come in is all kinds of rules that are meant to now hedge people in rather than allowing them to exchange ideas freely.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't, it comes down to the intent. What is the real intent behind the control? What is the real intent
Yeah.
to put those people together? Is it because they have a base knowledge of a subject, or because they're,
Yeah.
in favor in a certain way? I mean, it's,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're approaching an hour. Let's wrap things up here. So let me just thank everyone for joining us today. It was just an amazing discussion, and thank you, Ed and Dan, for your contributions. I just have to put in a plug for the National Association of Scholars here. If you really enjoyed this, consider becoming a member, because we're a fun group. And if you're already a member, let us know what you you'd like to do to help make the organization more effective. And if any questions are still out there that we weren't able to answer today, if they occur to you later, by all means, just send them to me at my email address. The email is Turner, Turner, at nas.org, and I'll do my best to convey those questions to our panelists today. So Ed and Dan, I'll leave it to you guys to have the last word. Any kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
Dan, you go first.
I mean, I guess just that, for me, after doing the research and putting this paper together, I just think that the one thing I take away from it was the value of that open-aired research that was able to be shared before 1900, where it seemed that there was a lot more freedom for scientists to meet and exchange ideas. Although we still have conferences today, I thought that was really the one thing that I'd always love to see going forward.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think you can see Bell certainly learned from a lot of other people. He did have a breakthrough that he realized that I've been studying the telephone litigation, and there were hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits where they tried to stop all these other phone companies that were trying to pop up all over the place. And over again, you see that they're raising all these other people. Oh, well, he really invented the telephone. And Bell had to go in and point out to the judge why what he did, his concept, his understanding of the principle was different from what had gone before. And, he won 600 or something like 600 lawsuits and didn't lose a single one. So, now some people, well, I won't go there. I won't go to 60 lawsuits. But, I do think it's really interesting and important to study as a historian, to study the past and to learn from the past and learn those lessons. And, so that's why, if anybody wants it, they can go to AmericanHeritage.com, get a free subscription. We're digital, and we give it away free because we want more people to read it. And same thing with Invention and Tech. Invention Technology is the only popular magazine of the history of technology. And we're relaunching it this fall. And again, it's also free.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So people can just
we believe in sharing information.
Good. So people can just type in the titles of those journals in Google, and they'll come up.
And they're free.
Yeah, and they're free. Yes, and I actually have read the journals, and I recommend it to everyone out there. So, all right. Well, again, thanks for coming to today's American Innovation webinar. And with that, I'll bid you all a good day, and thanks for coming. Thanks.